Hello, you're watching the Nouvel Esprit video series on the theology of the body. In this video, we are focusing on audience 25. We are your hosts. I am Jeremy Hossotter.
And I'm Guillermo Moreno.
So diving into our audience. All right. So we begin with Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 to 28. And we begin with these words, quote, "You have heard," end quote. Now, these words signify an address by Christ to historical man. Now, historical man is every single human being that is in the state of original sin. It applies to Adam and Eve after they sinned by eating the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, to all their descendants, to Christ's interlocutors, the people he is addressing at the Sermon on the Mount, which is where this verses are from. It's part of those 3 chapters where Jesus is giving the new law of the new covenant, the Sermon on the Mount. And we have also today, here and now, we are also in the state of original sin. So we too are historical man. And so Christ's words are addressed to us here and now today. And Christ's words are also addressed to all future man, because all future offspring of men and women today will be also in this state of original sin and part of historical man. So all of humanity shares the same theological prehistory of the text in Genesis chapters 1, 2, 3, and 4, and so on. And that means that all of humanity have inherited the meaning of the body from the beginning that we spent all of chapter 1 describing, the audiences 1 through 23. And so this everything, all this then applies to what Jesus is saying at the Sermon of the Mount. And as we said, it's going to apply to all of humanity, past, present, and future. And historical man is, since we are in the state of original sin as historical man is within the knowledge of good and evil, because in one respect we could say Adam and Eve were outside of this knowledge before they ate the fruit. It's by eating the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil that they thereby gain such knowledge in some respect. And so they went from outside to being inside, and all of humanity is now inside this knowledge. And the historical man applies not just to Christians, not just to pagans, but everybody, including the atheists, the Buddhists, everyone. And we are all bound to the words of Christ here in Matthew 5 through either natural law or the 10 Commandments. 10 Commandments if you're Christian, or natural law, which is something everybody can fall back on as something inscribed in the human heart, the law of God. Did you have anything you want to add here, Guillermo?
I do not.
All right. It's a fairly straightforward who is historical man.
Yeah.
All right. The dimension of the heart. We have been talking about in the previous audience how the Sermon on the Mount is a shift in our ethical understanding from kind of a legalism where we are just thinking in terms of what are the rules and how do I just get by following rules, to the conversion of the heart, to living morally according to the inner dimension of the heart. And so Christ had shifted the question of fulfilling the moral law to the dimension of the heart. And so the words of Christ here have both anthropological and ethical content and meaning. Now, by anthropological, what we mean is the theory or the what is man, right? Anthropology is the study of man. So anthropological is referring to the constitution of who is man. So Christ's words here then are relevant to understanding who is man and what is the moral content. And these two contents, the anthropological and the ethical, are linked together in the heart of man. And so when we think about the beginning from chapter 1, because we are now in chapter 2, in chapter 1, we talked about the meaning of the body, we talked about sex, the spousal meaning, the generative meaning, and keep in mind by sex, JP2 is referring to the masculinity and femininity of the body, not the conjugal act itself. So all these things, masculinity, femininity, the body, the spousal meaning, the genitive meaning, are all linked to the inner dimension of man through Christ's words here. And now we can go off on a tangent where JP2 gives us a little bit of information about the theology of the heart in footnote 40. So the biblical meaning of the heart in both the New and Old Testaments, a heart represents the center of man, the source of his will, his thoughts, his emotions, affections, desires, and attitudes. So this is different from how we typically think of the heart today. We normally think of it in terms of just a organ of the body that pumps blood. But for the Jew in the time of Jesus and before, the heart was the center of the human being, the center of his personal identity, and the center of action of his interior life, his subjectivity. And here, JP2 quoted, well, one of the quotes is from the thinker Schleyer, and here it is, quote, "The heart is the secret inner root of man, and thus of his world, the unfathomable ground and living power of all existential experience and decision." End quote. So that is the heart, or we could say the heart of the matter concerning the heart in terms of the Bible.
Jeremy,
Yes, Guillermo.
a little off topic, but why do
Uh-oh.
you think um the Jews would use the term the heart, um, which so happens to be the organ that pumps blood throughout our bodies?
That's a great question.
I Yeah, I guess for lack of other words, as opposed to the brain,
Right.
where we do our thinking and uh conscious decision making ish.
Well, I think what came to my mind is actually Deuteronomy.
Oh,
So let's see here. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 5, let's see if I can find a Catholic version of it real quick. Here we go. We'll go with the Douay Rheims version. Thou shalt, well, I should say, quote, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with thy whole heart and with thy whole soul and with thy whole strength," end quote. It doesn't say anything about the will, or not the will, but it doesn't say anything about thinking, right?
hmm.
You, I think the emphasis is the supreme commandment, as Jesus talked about with, I forget where in the Gospels. The supreme commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, and all your might. And then the second commandment is to love your neighbor as thyself. Right?
All
The
right.
the greatest commandment is not to think about God, but to love God.
Mm, interesting.
I know like a lot of people put a lot of emphasis on reason and intellect and concepts, but at the end of the day, that's not what's going to get you to heaven. It's a question of whether you've loved or not. So I would suspect that there's probably a fundamental insight, this connection of heart and love and the importance of that. But again, this is just me spitballing on the spot without
Oh,
actually
okay.
diving deeper into that question. But
No,
that is
that
an important question.
no, that does make sense. I know on my end, what comes to mind is vitality. The heart, it's just the organ that makes our um life, I guess, just the most evident because, well, it's constant. Well, I guess besides the lungs,
Yeah.
but it's pumping the life source, for lack of other words, throughout our body. And
Yeah.
there's just something about life and will that I see a connection there in a way
Yeah.
distinct than the from the intellect.
I think what you said there reminded me of another good point is that for the Jews, the blood is the life within the being.
Oh, all right.
That it's the blood that's the life of the animal or life of the human. And it's by the blood that you have the atonement of sins. It's by the blood of the cow or whatever
Yeah.
that the Israelites made atonement for their sins. It's by the blood of
Okay.
Christ that we have the
Yep.
atonement
Mm-hmm.
for our
Mm-hmm.
sins and sins of all humanity.
Yep.
So there you could perhaps that's also a connection. Um, let's see. I feel like there was something else I wanted to say, but I forgot what it was now. Oh,
All right.
an
Oh,
interesting point is this. You can live without a brain, but you cannot live without a heart, just medically speaking.
uh, I didn't think we could live without a brain
What do you need a brain for?
to dictate the organs what to do.
What is the brain doing there?
It's keeping the body, I guess, united.
It's doesn't keep it united down. It doesn't
Ho-
do anything in terms of circulation, the recycling of nutrients and waste disposal.
It's in charge of the nervous system,
Sure,
which, okay, that's throughout the whole body.
sure. But
Now,
there's
okay,
also nervous, you also have other nervous systems in the body, like in the intestines, I believe.
so there's cases of people who are medically alive without their brain.
Well, yeah, this goes off on a tangent of
Sure.
whether brain death is actually death or not. And for the interested reader or listener, I should say, um, check out the medical research of Dr. Alan Schumann. His last name is spelled Shewmon. He has done a lot of research on brain dead patients. And it's actually quite fascinating because he had this one patient where the woman was brain dead, but the baby that she was pregnant with was still able to be gestated and delivered. They did
Yikes.
a C-section to deliver it, but the baby was still able to be gestated. What do you need a brain for then if you can gestate a baby? Just saying. That's a weird thought.
And yeah, maybe it's a topic for another time.
Oh yeah, brain death is a great podcast idea.
Oh,
But regardless, medical research seems to suggest you don't need a brain to function at a vegetative level.
Okay, that I didn't
But
know.
but that does require medical intervention.
Exactly. The subject is still under life support somehow.
Exactly.
Okay, well then now that's a whole different
Yeah, it's a
story.
whole complicated story.
Yeah, I'll bet.
Back to theology of the body.
But
Theology of the body now.
I'm kidding.
Ah, it's relevant.
Of course.
Brain depth, body. Hmm. All right. More on desire. So, I feel like we skipped a slide. Aha, we did skip a slide. Sometimes my mouse double clicks. All right, adultery and desire. Christ used the term adultery in Matthew 5. Now, JP2 wants to note that we are not using it in its strict meaning as like an extramarital affair, like a husband cheating on his wife by having sex with another woman. That is part of Christ's meaning here, but there's a more generalized meaning as signifying the violation of the unity of the man and woman as spouses in a one flesh union. There are far more ways of violating this unity than adultery alone. And so, what JP2 wants to draw our attention to is the interior dimension of the heart here. So, we want to get at what is at stake precisely with this fundamental revision in understanding the moral law from this interior dimension. So, this adultery in the heart, then, we observe in Matthew 5 as being committed by looking at the woman in desire. And this is an interior action. Now, this is a desire to unite with her as a spouse without actually being her spouse. And we can also observe that this desire is expressed through sight. It is by looking at the woman that we have the desire for her. And these are going to be themes that we are certainly going to be examining more. I thought about going on a tangent here by talking about this concept of looking, but we'll save it for a later audience. All right, now we can talk about more on desire. So Christ doesn't specify whether this woman in Matthew 5 is married or not, but his words will apply to either case. It doesn't matter whether the woman is married or not. When you look with this particular kind of desire that you commit adultery with her in your heart, it doesn't matter whether she's actually married or not. You have this problem with your heart and how you are treating this other person. And so JP2 observes then that this fundamental revision of ethics that Christ is demanding upon us requires a conformity of our interior and exterior actions. So it's not enough that you just don't physically commit adultery with another woman, but with your heart, you have to also not do so. You cannot desire another woman with the intention of wanting to unite with her sex in a spousal way. This interior dimension of the heart has to be united with the exterior. And this is what JP2 called in an earlier audience the living ethos, a living ethics that our moral well being has to be actually lived out interiorly and exteriorly. Now, this conformity of the interior and exterior acts is done by the man as a husband looking and desiring his wife and not looking at the woman with this adulterous desire. So I guess to rephrase that, in order to have the conformity of the moral law with the interior and exterior acts, you have the interior act where the man and woman have to desire each other in the right way, You have the exterior act of the conjugal act, and then there's the ethical component to this where the conjugal act is done in a legitimate way. All three of these elements have to be in conformity with each other. And when they're not, then you have this problem where the man and the woman are not fulfilling their vocation of being a person, of fulfilling that original vision of God from the mystery of creation. And we need to make a distinction now between desire and desire. In one sense, desire itself is used in a way that is in conformity with ethics, and in another sense, it's used in a way that's not in conformity. So desire can be either good or bad, and it depends upon the heart and what is being desired. And of course, JP2 is going to go into more detail about this distinction of a good desire and a bad desire. And lastly, we can note that Christ's words here in chapter 5 applies to both men and women. We can't just be hung up on the fact that Christ says if a man looks at another woman, if he desires another woman, he commits adultery in his heart. We can't just look at that specific example and say, oh, well, then it's okay for a woman to look in a way that's in a desirous way that doesn't commit adultery. Right. It would be false to say the woman's incapable of doing this. In reality, it is both the man and the woman can perform the same action of this bad desiring that violates the dignity of the person. Guillermo, did you have anything you would like to add?
I do not.
Okay, you just been quiet. Gotta make sure you're still there breathing. Concluding reflections then. So desire and look have their own theological content that is linked to the meaning of the body from the beginning. This requires returning to the beginning. In particular, in this chapter, we're going to be focusing more so on chapter 3 of Genesis. Now, let's see here. As we said before, we cannot take this particular example as just simply that as like what Christ is getting at. We need to keep in mind that Christ is getting at taking us to the full, the deep inner dimension of the heart of man to understand how to fulfill the law. And this verse about committing adultery in the heart is the vignette, the window in which we can view and discern how to fulfill the content of that moral life. And so we can also note that Christ's words here in Matthew 5 informs us that we are able to, in fact, derive truths about historical man and the meaning of the body. And that's just an important point because this helps anchor ourselves against a skepticism that says, well, man, after original sin was corrupted, and you just can't really know anything about him because our mind is so corrupted, or maybe historical man is so corrupted, or that the body is something evil now. You know, these are kind of skepticisms of the body that we want to push back against. And in fact, we will learn more about this in later audiences. I think I think it's in like chapter 3 or part 2. I forget where. Um, anything else, Guillermo, before we conclude?
No, that's all.
All right. In that case, Oh, we have vocabulary. Awesome. Hmm. Now, a particular phrase that has shown up a handful of times now over the course of the audiences that we haven't defined yet is this term intentionality. Now, this comes from phenomenology. It's a modern school of philosophy. Um, and intentionality is a power that is particular to persons. And so when we talk about animals, they have drives and instincts, and they have these impressions that they receive, right? When we think about sight, there's this sense data that they just receive and then they act accordingly by drives and instincts. Now, intentionality refers to the relationship between an object and a subject. Man is a subject in that he is the subject of a relation to an object. So when a man thinks, he is always thinking of a something. So man is the thinking subject, and what he's thinking about is the object. Similarly, when man imagines, he is imagining something. When man thinks, or I should think, when man loves, he is loving a someone. He loves a someone. There are particular acts of man that are intentional. They're always directed towards an object. They're always in reference to an object. When we think about breathing, breathing itself doesn't really have, it does not have an object. This is something automatically done by the body. So is the circulation of blood. Or just if someone were to take one of those, if you're in like the doctor's office, someone takes a hammer and taps your knee and your knee kicks, that's just a reflex. Those are not actions of the human person. They're just, we could say, acts of man, but they're not acts that flow from the interiority, from the subjectivity of man. What gives man subjectivity is those acts that make him a subject. And what all these acts that make man a subject, they're all have this subject object relation. That is to say, they are intentional. So acts such as thinking and willing and the emotions in their pure sense, in their pure meaning, are all have a fundamental depth centered in the heart of man as intentional. They belong to the spiritual nature of man. Love and joy are object directed emotions, and so they belong properly to the spirituality of man. Now, something to keep in mind is that intentional here does not mean on purpose, because the emotions are not something that we conjure at our own whim on command by our will. They are something that we are receiving and experiencing while still being object directed towards a thing. So an object in the relation of intentionality need not have a purpose, right? Whereas in terms of purpose, what we mean is just a content of the will, right? If I drive a car, I'm doing that with a purpose, right? But that is different than an act of love, right? If I love someone, that love is directed to the other. And this is an important distinction because it really informs us about the metaphysical difference between man and animal from uh, the perspective of phenomenology and philosophy, because animals, properly speaking, do not have an object. They do not uh, how they behave cognitively is incapable of, excuse me a moment, is incapable of possessing an object in this manner that the human spirit is, because they are non-personal beings. So people say that their dogs love them. Properly speaking, they do not, because they do not, the dog is incapable of establishing this intentional relationship between the dog and the owner. And that is a very important point that is undergirding a lot of the theology of the body from a philosophical, in terms of its philosophical foundations, is this concept of intentionality. This concept of intentionality goes back to Husserl, the founder of phenomenology, and Husserl got it from Franz Brentano, an interesting thinker in his own right. And that's to go off into a little bit of a tangent. If what we said here has interested you, there's a very interesting and thought-provocative book called The Human Place in the Cosmos by Max Shaler. And in this book, it talks about the distinction between man and animal according to this power of intentionality. Now, one warning is that the book itself is quite limited in that as you progress in reading it, you come to the realization that Max Shaler will fundamentally end up arguing for pantheism, which is heretical. It's a condemned position. You cannot, yeah, and pantheism is the view that essentially everything is God. So that is a warning about this book by Max Shaler, but it is also contains several insights about man and animal, and certainly well worth your time if you want to dive into a difficult text of German phenomenology. Though it's not as difficult as some others. Guillermo, did you have anything you would like to add?
Just one clarification or question. Would it be fair to say that since animals are not subjects, they are therefore objects?
I guess that would depend on how are you using the word object.
Because animals still act somehow on their initiative. And I get how they're not persons and they're not capable of the things that persons are, love and reason. Okay, great. But to say that they're not subjects, like, okay, then if they are objects,
Well, this really comes into the how are you going to use the term object? Because if I'm a person talking about an animal, that animal is now the object of my act of talking about them, right?
mhm,
And I assume that's not the meaning you are referring to here. Are you referring to like an animal sees another animal and you think, oh, well, the sense perception of animal A from animal B means that animal B is objectifying animal A?
that's what I thought.
Yeah, and that in one sense is going to be true, in one sense it's false. In one sense, it's true that you can use the term object to refer to the thing that is the object of the sense perception. But by doing so, you're introducing an equivocation because the animal that's objectifying the second animal is not thinking about that animal as an object, but as a response to sense stimuli. In fact, it would be abuse of the term to use the word think, because the acting of the animal is in terms of senses and drives. of reactions, right? There is not this object, how the phenomenologist would use the term intentionality. When we talk about intentionality, you have the thing becoming the theme, the object of I guess the object of the action. It's I guess a proper way of thinking about it is the animal does not have a world. It has an environment and it acts according to the parameters of sustaining its life in the environment. But the animal cannot take the environment as an object and start engaging in it as an object. Like, I can look at the environment and say, it's hot, it's cold. I need to build a house to protect myself from the storm. I need to do X, Y, Z. An animal cannot do that. An animal will look at the lion and say, yes, and recognize that's a threat to its livelihood, but it's not going to consider the nature of lion itself or the different uses it might have with a lion. Like, oh, I can use its bones to make spoons or something. I can use its hide to make a blanket. Or you think about the lions looking at the herd of zebras. Yes, they see food. And yes, they might recognize zebra is their favorite food. But on the other hand, they don't recognize it in terms of, oh, there's 132 zebras here. They do not do math. They just see zebras, time to eat. They're at the level of instinct and drives. They do not see, they recognize this is a good target versus this is a bad target. The healthy male zebra, not going to chase. The weak, old looking zebra, I'm going to eat that one because that one's easy to kill. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah, it's that question you ask, Guillermo, is one of the hardest things to understand about animal versus human and this distinction of intentionality. And that's partly why I think Shaler's analysis in that book is so helpful because he goes through this in patient detail and it's a very short book. But as I said, Shaler goes crazy by the end of the book since he argues for pantheism. It just kind of shows you the limits of brilliance in some respect. Did you have any clarifying questions about that?
Nope.
No? Okay. I just want to ask since I felt like I just went on a rant for a few minutes.
No, you're good. I understand how this is when it comes to animals. Yeah, these questions are complex in their own way.
Yeah, no. We're when we're losing sight as a society of this
Oh yeah,
distinction between man and animal, and that
yeah.
just it's going to confuse it much more.
Oh yeah.
And it's why I thought it would be good that we just talk about it for a few minutes. So I'm glad you brought up that question, especially in light of a lot of modern movements today. Like, oh, well, this is my fur baby. I'm a proud parent of 5 fur babies. I'm like, no, you're not. You did
I
nothing. You did
I
not push that dog out of your womb through your vagina. Just saying. That is not your baby. You went to a store and you bought that thing.
or somebody gave it to you.
Or someone gave it to you. Or maybe you found it on the street and nursed it back to health. But you did not push that through and gave birth to it. But of course, that's also me just taking that a little bit more literally than what most people will.
No, no. In fact, I even thought of veganism, about how like I don't think it's well, it's not bad in and of itself, but the reason why is because of this idolatry for animals.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll readily admit there is such a thing as cruelty to animals, of course, and that's
Oh, yeah.
horrible. It's a sin.
It is.
Yeah.
Some of our
Um,
practices for growing meat is terrible.
I I'm curious about how so, and maybe a
Uh,
topic for another podcast because yeah.
um, yeah. I think I'll just say briefly
Okay.
for the interested audience, there's a book called Fast Food Nation, and it's pretty much a history of fast food. And it goes into the practices of fast food. It's a very good book. And there's also a movie or documentary. I think it's called Food Inc. So anyone interested, there's a couple of very interesting sources you can look at on this topic. All
Awesome.
right. All right. Did you have anything else you would like to add, Guillermo?
Nope.
All right. In that case, I think it's time to end this. Thank you for watching our video, and hopefully our rants was somewhat informative. If you have been enjoying our content, please subscribe to our social media and consider making a financial donation, either through PayPal or through Patreon. Your financial support goes towards the maintenance of our website and the purchase of resources for us to continue making great content for you. Speaking of great content, on our website, nouvelesprit.com, there are many articles. You can check that out. There's lots of fun reading there on all sorts of topics. And you can also find our podcast. Guillermo, would you like to give us more information about our podcast?
Yes, we upload our podcast episodes in which we talk about various other topics besides this is besides this theology of the body series that we have. In our first season of the Nouvel Esprit podcast, we talk about trends in culture, politics, and what topics that we feel the need to talk about, always through a Catholic personalist perspective, I should say. Now, we upload our episodes onto buzzsprout.com. You can find the link to our episodes on lenovelesprit.com. Listen to us on Buzzsprout itself, or use Buzzsprout to locate our La Novella Esprit podcast in many of the mainstream platforms for podcasting, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts.
All right. Thank you for that, Guillermo. And in case you were interested, you can find all of our social media at lenovelesprit.com/subscribe. Um, please continue to support us in our cause, whether it's simply a like on social media or a share with a friend. Every little bit goes a long ways into spreading the good news. So thank you for that.
Yes, and please, our viewers and listeners, keep us and our mission in your prayers.
Yep. Please pray for us. And with that, I'm going to say goodbye.
Bye, everyone. God bless.